Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this first seminar of the year of the UNE Business School. And I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land that we call New England and show respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging of this nation. So this year we will start with Matthew. Matthew was kindly offering this seminar. For those who don't know Mathew Frith, he's a lecturer at the UNE Business School. He received his PhD in economics from Federation University of Australia last year, and his dissertation was concerned about the 19th century American Protectionist School of Economic Thought, and he was awarded the 2024 Best PhD Dissertation Prize from the History of Economic Thought Society of Australia. So very interesting and contemporary topics. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you very much.
Okay. Should I go ahead and make a start? Yep. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming along to my seminar today. And thank you very much to Emilio for organising this. Also Joey for promoting the seminar. I'm not sure if he's actually here today. Thank you to anyone who may have contributed behind the scenes as well. I'd also like to acknowledge Jerry Corvasanis, who was my former supervisor, who read over an earlier draft of the paper. So the topic of today's seminar is Buren Denslow and the migratory theory of profits. Now, Denslow is a very obscure figure, even among historians of economic thought. So I think it would be useful to give a background to the economic tradition that he comes from, and also a background to the figure himself before actually moving into a discussion of his migratory theory of profits. Just hit to the next slide. Oh, okay, I have a flicker. Yep, all good. So Buren Denslow was a member of the American Protectionist School of Economics. As Emilio mentioned, I wrote my PhD thesis on this particular school of thought. So the school existed from roughly 1790 to the early 20th century. It emerged with the ideas of Alexander Hamilton and his contemporaries, these being Tench Coxe and also the lesser known William Barton. So Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington, and during this time, along with Tench Coxe, he wrote what was known as the Report on Manufactures, which can be viewed as the founding document of this particular school of thought. And then you had various followers of Hamilton that then went on to systematize these ideas. So the American Protectionist School advocated what is known as the American system of capitalism, which consisted of three planks. The first being protective tariffs, the second being infrastructure, or what they called internal improvements. And they saw tariffs and infrastructure as being complementary. Tariffs were to be used for the protection of industry and also to generate revenue. And this revenue would then be used to finance infrastructure as well as the general operations of government. And finally, and contrary to what many might expect, the third plank was actually support for free internal markets and low levels of domestic taxation. So the idea is that your domestic economy is protected from foreign competition, but there's limited regulation and taxation within the domestic economy. So even though they saw a significant role for government, they were also very explicit in setting limits on government's role, so as to not to over-regulate the productive sectors of the economy. So the purpose of this system was to create conditions conducive to entrepreneurship, the development of private enterprise, and also the diversity of economic pursuits. And this emphasis on entrepreneurship will be demonstrated as we go into Denslow's theory of migratory profits. Finally, the American Protectionist School aligned themselves with the Federalist Whig and Republican parties. In fact, Denslow himself was a member of the Republican Party and would write for various Republican-aligned newspapers. Many of the economists in the school would actually advise Republican administrations. In my research, however, I couldn't find any direct evidence of Denslow himself directly advising Republican statesmen or Republican presidents. I do know, however, that his major work, which was the Principles of the Economic Philosophy of Society, Government and Industry, it was read by a number of Republican statesmen, and most notably the presidential candidate, James G. Blaine, spoke very highly of the work and even reviewed the work. So there is some indication that he may have had some indirect influence on public policy. Now, this slide lists some of the key theoretical views of the American protectionist writers. I document these at length in my dissertation, but I don't really have time to explore them fully in this talk, but I'll give a quick rundown, which will provide useful context for our discussion later. So the American Protectionist School placed a heavy emphasis on invention and human ingenuity. According to the American Protectionists, economic growth and development was fundamentally the result of man using his ingenuity and inventive faculties to transform nature into instruments that are fit for human use. This is actually very different to the classical rendering of growth, by the way. The classical rendering of growth emphasises capital accumulation. By the way, when I say classical, I'm referring to the school of thought, which is associated with the likes of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill. Now, on the issue of growth, the American protectionists developed their own terminology when discussing growth. They emphasise what they termed inventive growth, which is growth involving man's ingenuity and invention, and they contrasted this with what they called accumulative growth, which is basically capital accumulation. So that growth depicted in classical growth theory. Now, the American protectionists, of course, supported capital accumulation, but they saw that the primary driver of growth was always invention and human ingenuity. So they placed primacy on inventive growth over accumulative growth. Lastly, the American protectionists placed a lot of emphasis on entrepreneurship, and they conceived of the entrepreneur as fundamentally a discoverer of new economic pursuits. The French economists associated with the likes of Jean-Baptiste Say and others, they depicted the entrepreneur as fundamentally a broker between buyers and sellers. And you can also think of the neoclassical conception of the economist, basically viewing the entrepreneur as a coordinator of resources and a bearer of risk. So this conception of the entrepreneur as a discoverer is a very different depiction of the entrepreneur to most other schools of thought. This idea of the entrepreneur as discoverer will be exemplified more as we get into Denslow's theory of profits. Now, when we think back to the American system discussed earlier, this system was designed to be conducive to entrepreneurial discovery. You had your protective tariffs in place, and this was to give entrepreneurs breathing room to experiment and discover new economic pursuits. You had your infrastructure to boost productivity, and you also had low levels of regulation and domestic taxation, so entrepreneurs could conduct themselves unencumbered in the domestic market. So the American system was designed to facilitate this process of entrepreneurial discovery. Sorry, my throat's just getting a little dry. So in my broader research project on the American Protectionist School, which at this point is largely contained within my PhD thesis, I identified roughly 4 generations of American protectionists. So group 1 is the group associated with Alexander Hamilton and Tench Coxe. By the way, there are more figures than those listed on the slide. When I carried out my research, I identified roughly 70 economists as part of this school, so it was quite a large school of thought. Anyway, group 2 includes the likes of Mathew Carey, John Ray, Henry Clay, Daniel Raymond, and Friedrich List. Some of you may have heard of the economist Friedrich List. Group 3 largely clustered around Henry Charles Carey, who was by far the most influential economist in this school after Alexander Hamilton. And some of the other economists as part of this group include Horace Greeley, Pershine Smith, and Francis Bowen. Now, group 4 is actually the largest of the 4 groups, and it's also by far the most neglected in the secondary literature. and then Buren Denslow is actually part of this group. There was largely three thought leaders, in my view, within this group. This was Robert Ellis Thompson, William Elder, and of course, Van Buren Denslow. Now, in my opinion, or in my view, it was also with Group 4 that American protectionist thought became the most sophisticated and refined. And I'm also of the view that Denslow was probably one of the most sophisticated economists in this group. Now, this isn't to diminish the worth of the earlier economists as part of this school. Denslow was largely building upon the foundations left by these earlier theorists. He was heavily inspired and influenced by the likes of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Carey. In fact, Denslow had such high admiration for Carey that Denslow even named his son Henry Carey Denslow, so after Carey. And something which I picked up on actually while reading Denslow's work is that every time he refers to Henry Carey, it's always Dr. Carey, but he doesn't extend the same courtesy to John Stuart Mill, so it's always Mr. Mill whenever he talks about John Stuart Mill. So in any event, even though Denslow was drawing upon these earlier writers, he was also very original in his own way, and this is perhaps best demonstrated in his migratory theory of profits. Okay, now before moving on to this theory, I'll give a quick biographical sketch of Denslow's life. So Denslow was born in Yonkers, New York in 1833. He was admitted to the bar in 1855, but instead of entering the legal profession, he decided to pursue a career in journalism instead. In 1866, he became editor of the Chicago Tribune. This newspaper was actually affiliated with the renowned New York Tribune, which was also started by another influential American protectionist, Horace Greeley. In fact, for a short amount of time, Denslow had actually relocated back to New York after moving to Chicago and did serve a brief stint in the New York Tribune. In 1888, he became chief economic writer of the Chicago Inter-Ocean, which had a heavy protectionist orientation. Then in 1885, he became editor of the American Economist. Note that this is not the same as The Economist. The American Economist was a journal established by the American Protective Tariff League. Outside of journalism, Denslow also had an academic career. This started in the 1870s, so he worked concurrently at several different academic institutions. He lectured at the Union College of Law, and he was also professor of economics and law at Northwestern University and the Old University of Chicago. By the way, the Old University of Chicago doesn't actually have any direct continuity with the current University of Chicago. So the Old University of Chicago shut down in 1886 due to financial issues, and then what is now the University of Chicago was founded some years later. This lack of continuity is unfortunate because it means that none of the archival material from the Old University of Chicago survived, so it's a bit hard to piece together what Denslow was doing while at the University of Chicago. Okay, now Denslow wrote a number of important economic writings. I've listed some of the key ones on the slide, but by far his most important work was his 1888 Principles of the Economic Philosophy of Society, Government, and Industry. And it was in this work that he developed his migratory theory of profits. Now, finally, in 1902, Denslow passed away in New York. However, what I discovered during my archival research is he actually left a collection of unpublished manuscripts to his housekeeper upon his death. And these unpublished manuscripts remain lost until this day. I've tried to piece together the movements of the housekeeper as she travelled across the United States and have contacted various historical societies and archives to see whether maybe those manuscripts were deposited in any of them, but so far I've been unsuccessful in actually tracking down these lost manuscripts, assuming that they still actually exist. Anyway, that is a background to the school of thought which Denslow comes from, and also Denslow himself. We'll now move on to the main topic of today's seminar, which is his migratory theory of profits. Okay, now whereas earlier American protectionists such as John Ray, for example, had already explored the connection between invention and profit. Denslow goes much further than these early attempts through his migratory theory of profits. By the way, I should just clarify that I actually coined the term migratory theory of profits. Denslow himself doesn't use this term, but he does use the metaphor of migration to describe how profits influence economic activity within a capitalist economy. The theory is actually relatively simple. The core insight of this theory is that profit serves as a coordinating and steering mechanism within the economy. In Denslow's own words, profits are the migratory or steering principle in industries. Profits impel entrepreneurs to great inventions, discoveries, innovations, economies, and improvements. So in this theory, Denslow explains that profit represents a force which prompts entrepreneurs and by extension other economic resources to seek out, discover and migrate into new industrial pursuits. With these new industrial pursuits representing the embodiment of new inventions and new technologies. And it would be the discovery of these new inventions and industries which would sustain high profit rates within the economy. So to quote Denslow again, a high rate of profit are a mark or a sign that industry and progress are making successful advent into new fields or modes of industries. Profits cannot be expected to continue in any industry after it has become long-standing, except as it may be made a new industry by new processes, new conditions, or new demand. Nor is the earth by past advent in art approaching the period when large or high profits can no longer be made in industry of any kind, or when the transition of old populations to new industries cannot take place. Such a period is practically as far removed as ever. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that this theory of profit is also effectively an endogenous theory of technological change. Economics has conventionally depicted inventions and the emergence of new industries as something that arises exogenously. So it's the result of factors outside the economic system. But according to Denslow, profit is actually an internal mechanism which compels entrepreneurs to innovate and discover new pursuits. So the theory explains how economic forces themselves promote technological change. So it's an endogenous theory of technological change. I should note, by the way, that the broader thought of the American protectionists, by emphasizing human ingenuity, fundamentally treats invention as something that is endogenous. I mean, this is basically what is meant by the term inventive growth anyway. So this is a clear step above their classical counterparts, and it's also a step above a lot of later neoclassical theory. So it's a very innovative theory, and I might point out that Denslow developed this theory in 1888, so it was far ahead of its time. Now, I think it's actually worth pausing to contrast Denslow's approach to profit with the approach in neoclassical economics. Now, neoclassical economics does, of course, view profit as a signal within the economy, but it's a signal which operates to drive the market towards equilibrium. For Denslow, profit is not an equilibrating force, but a force for discovery. High profits compel entrepreneurs to move resources out of equilibrium and into newly discovered pursuits. Similarly, low rates of profit in stagnating industries signals entrepreneurs to actually seek out and discover entirely new industries. So it's a fundamentally different conception of profit's role compared to the neoclassical models. It's not an equilibrating mechanism, it's a mechanism for discovery. And over time, the discovery of these new industries would result in a greater variety and diversification of industry. And this is an important objective in itself for the broader American Protectionist School. If any of you were here last year for my talk, I go into more detail of the role of economic diversification in that talk. So you can actually go back and find a recording of that if you're interested, or you can always ask me to elaborate on that in the Q&A. Now, this theory of migratory profits holds important implications for the trajectory of capitalism, and I'm specifically talking about the tendency of for the rate of profit to fall. So throughout the history of economic thought, there has been this widely held view that there's a general tendency for the rate of profit to fall within capitalist economies. This was a view held by the classical economists, it was a view held by Karl Marx, and it was also a view held by many early neoclassical economists as well. So I have a few quotes here. Adam Smith said that as capital increases in any country, the profits which can be made by employing them necessarily diminish. It becomes gradually more and more difficult to find within the country a profitable mode of employing any new capital. Karl Marx said that the progressive tendency of the general rate of profit to fall is therefore just an expression of the, is just an expression peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. And William Stanley Jevons, who is actually the handsome chap depicted on the slides there, he was a marginalist and one of the forerunners of neoclassical economics. He said that it is one of the favourite doctrines of economists since the times of Adam Smith that as society progresses and capital accumulates, that the rate of profit, or more strictly speaking, the rate of interest tends to fall. There is sufficient statistical facts to confirm this conclusion. The only question that can arise is to the actual causes of this tendency. Now, the last part of Jevons's quote is important to note. There wasn't one single theory which explained this tendency. Each of the different schools of thought and also economists within each school tended to have their own explanation as to why this tends to occur. So Adam Smith thought it was due to competitive pressures and an exhaustion of investment opportunities. So as new producers enter the market, this would put downward pressure on profit rates. David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, they thought it was due to the declining availability of agricultural land. And when you have, declining availability of fertile agricultural land. As cultivation proceeds more and more to less fertile land, this would increase the price of food. Because food is now more expensive, workers would demand higher wages, and eventually these higher wages would deplete the capitalist profits. And Karl Marx argued that there would be this overaccumulation of capital. In particular, capitalists would invest in labour-saving machines. So you have this overaccumulation of capital, while at the same time you have these workers which are losing their jobs and are also being exploited. So you'd have this fundamental mismatch between productive power and purchasing power. This would lead to a declining rate of profits, and it would eventually cause capitalism to collapse, according to Karl Marx. And finally, the early marginalists and neoclassicals, they'd argue that this was just a natural result of diminishing marginal returns on capital. So effectively the same thing. So in any event, you might be wondering why this issue is important. It's important because if profits eventually decline to zero, either you have a situation like what Karl Marx predicted, where capitalism would collapse, or you'd have a situation which was prophesized by the likes of Ricardo and Mill, where the economy would just enter into a stationary state. And in the case of Ricardo, this stationary state would be locked at subsistence. So a rather bleak situation prophesied by Ricardo. In contrast to these other thinkers, then Buren Denslow's theory demonstrates that there is in fact no general tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And indeed, a falling rate of profit in stagnant industries is actually one of the endogenous forces which compels entrepreneurs to engage in entrepreneurial discovery. And this brings forth new sources of profit. So to quote Denslow, a great deal of effort has been expended to prove what Mr. John Stuart Mill calls the tendency of the rate of profit to fall to a minimum. As this relates to each particular enterprise in which profits are won, this is more than true. Indeed, yet it is inadequate to the truth. Profits may be said to begin at unlimited figures and recede rapidly until they totally disappear. Each particular mode of investment invites competition from others and a rise in wages, rent and interest until this swallows up all returns or profits. If this was not so, profit would not be the migratory force which pioneers the way into new fields, processes and modes. But when this doctrine is stated as a tendency for the rate of profit to fall as society advances, it's a palpable absurdity. All observation indicates that as large profits are arising in new industries, the same as when the old gave rise to large profits when they were new, or to use the old adage, there is always good fish in the sea as we're ever caught out. So according to Denslow, a declining rate of profit is simply a reflection of declining profits in stagnant and mature industries. Profits may well fall in such industries, but new and profitable industries will continue to emerge, which will restore profit rates. Moreover, the decline of profit rates in stagnant industries is one of the very mechanisms which actually leads entrepreneurs and capitalists to seek out new and profitable modes of production. So according to Denslow, there is no general tendency for rates of profit to fall within capitalist economies, and there's therefore no internal contradiction within capitalism. Profit instead acts as an endogenous force which perpetually reinvigorates and revitalises the capitalist economy. Just make sure I'm on the right side. Okay. Now, I should just emphasise that Denslow was not naive. He saw that often this migration into new industrial pursuits was not seamless, and it sometimes took an economic crisis for the restoration of profit and a migration of entrepreneurs and resources to take place. Now, this aspect of Denslow's theory builds upon a larger business cycle tradition within the American Protectionist School of Thought, which I can't go into fully here. But in short, the American Protectionists did not accept the traditional, well, it wasn't traditional at the time, but they did not accept the Keynesian explanation that recessions are the result of aggregate demand deficiency. Now, of course, there were no Keynesians at the time, but you did have various thinkers which were known as underconsumptionists, which effectively had pretty similar theories to Keynes, maybe not as elaborate, but very similar theories to Keynes, but they just came before Keynes. So you can think of Robert Thomas Malthus, Sismondi, Thorstein Veblen, and even Karl Marx has also been labelled as an underconsumptionist as well. So the American protectionists, by and large, rejected the view that recessions could be the result of generalised underconsumption. They instead taught that recessions were the result of the overproduction of specific sectors of the economy, and this was often due to the introduction of productivity-enhancing inventions and processes and those sorts of things. Now, the American protectionists generally argued that a more diversified economy would mitigate against recessions. However, recessions were still oftentimes viewed as inevitable to allow the economy to shift resources from oversupplied sectors to new and emerging sectors, basically. So Denslow is largely building upon this business cycle tradition, and he connects this with his theory of profit. So to quote Denslow, commercial crises rectify the steering of industry, which tends naturally to keep on forever unless checked in routines of profit making, which have for a long time been profitable, but which have become unprofitable to the world at large when persisted in too long. Commercial crises in these instances are a means of correcting undue persistence in beaten ways of industry and turning capital and labour into new and unbeaten ways where they are more needed. Industry needs to be migratory in order to attain its highest evolution. A commercial crisis sweeping away all values like a whirlwind by making failure universal prevents it from becoming mortifying and paralysing. All conductors of industry and employers of labour whose position are weak are weeded out and must look for something new. In this universal search for something new, those new industries are found and developed in which society is chiefly interested because in them lie the great profits and the great utilities. Now, I don't think that Denslow necessarily views the need for an economic crisis as the standard case. He seems to suggest more broadly that normally this migratory process would take place without needing a crisis to correct things as such. However, he still accepts that sometimes when you have these instances where industries become saturated and excessively overworked, and in these cases, economic crises basically serve a function of kickstarting the economy by prompting this entrepreneurial discovery process. So this systematic lowering of profits in the times of economic crises compels entrepreneurs to abandon existing and overworked industries to seek out new ones. Now, I guess this is the more controversial side of things. It does raise the question as to whether Keynesian, and I know Tony's going to attack me for this, but whether Keynesian stimulus spending is actually a desirable policy. If you're artificially propping up profit rates by engaging in stimulus to boost aggregate demand, then you're actually disrupting this migratory force within the economy. And conceivably, assuming if Denslow is correct, you could actually be prolonging the crisis because you're preventing entrepreneurs from discovering new industries, which Denslow argued would be the real means of getting an economy out of a recession. Anyway, I might leave the discussion there and pass it over to the Q&A. Yep, thank you.